and we are recording now as well. So this is, again, this is the last class that I'm giving as part of a series. You might recall before Pesach, you can think all the way back. I was working on a curriculum for bar mitzvah students and bat mitzvah students for that matter. And I'm utilizing a curriculum that comes from the Biur HaTefillah Institute. And it is quite good. It is quite fantastic. And I felt that the lessons and the content are worthy of adults' study as well. And obviously it's being modified for younger students. And we've been talking about the origin of Tefillah, the institutions of prayer, the synagogue, its evolution, and all things related to Tefillah B'tzibur, like communal prayer. Today we're going to be talking about the Haftorah, as well as the link between the study of Torah and prayer. And what you see in front of you at the very top is a section in Hebrew, and then it's followed with a translation. We're on the second page in the handout that we have in person here. We're about to start discussing the origin of the Haftorah. Now, what exactly is the Haftorah? I sometimes get asked by bar mitzvah students and bat mitzvah students, what exactly is the Haftorah? And the Haftorah, that's a legitimate question. What exactly is it? Well, the Haftorah is a reading from the books of the prophets, usually on a theme that correlates with the weekly Torah reading. And it is tacked on, it's added to the end of the Torah reading part of the service. However, several questions could be asked, and these are some of the questions that I'm hoping we're going to address tonight. The first question is, why do we have an extra aliyah? Now, what do I mean? Well, on a Shabbat, we have 7 aliyot. There are 7 people who are called up for the public reading of the Torah. But then we say Kaddish, a half Kaddish. Half Kaddish, if you're familiar with the Siddur, is something that we've discussed here together in the past. The half Kaddish indicates that we have now ended a portion of the service and we're about to start something new. So obviously, if we say Kaddish after the 7th aliyah, that means that the Torah reading is over. Why do we add an additional portion of the Torah that's read after that Kaddish? Why is there an extra aliyah? That's going to be one thing I hope we discuss tonight. So we know that this is an additional aliyah from the fact that there's Kaddish that precedes it. Another obvious question is if you pay very careful, if you pay close attention, you'll notice that the maftir, which is what we call that extra aliyah of the Torah reading, is just a repetition of some verses, usually anyways, from the Torah reading that we just read. So the question is, why do we repeat a portion of the Torah reading? And why is that so closely associated with the Haftorah? Why is it that the person who reads the Haftorah is called up for this additional aliyah where they repeat verses from the Torah reading? So in order to answer this question, we're going to start examining the origin of the reading of the Haftorah. Where does it come from? What are its sources? And we're going to discuss 5 different explanations, and they all might be true. They all might be an indication of historical trends and patterns that culminated in this practice of reading the Haftorah. Again, the Haftorah being words from the Nevi'im, verses from the Nevi'im that we read following the Torah reading. So the very first source that you see in front of you is the Avudraham. The Avudraham was a 14th century Spanish rabbi who lived in Seville. He was a student of Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, who was an interesting individual himself. He was an Ashkenazi who lived in who moved to Barcelona as a child and then became a rabbi in Seville. And he was the primary teacher of the Avudraham. And again, this is 14th century. This is the 1300s. And the Avudraham wrote a commentary on the Siddur that has preserved the historic Nusach Sfaradi, the Nusach HaTefillah, the order of prayer as observed by Jews of Spanish descent. He also provides a commentary and traditional rabbinic explanations to the prayers. And here we have a very traditional understanding of what the Haftorah comes to accomplish. And this is what he writes. And this is source number 1 on the very top of the page in front of you. It says, V'achar shegolulin sefer Torah kore Haftorah. After we read the Torah reading, we then read the Haftorah. V'tzorech sheyeh ba mi'inyan parshas hayom. It should relate, it should be on the same theme as the Torah reading of that day. V'lama maftirim b'nevi'im. Why do we read from the prophets after the Torah reading? So this is answer number one. He says, Lefi shegozru al Yisrael shelo yikru b'Torah. Since there was a period of time, presumably during the time of the Chashmonaim, during the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. So we're talking here in about like the 2nd century before the Common Era. There were decrees against the study of the Torah because there was an attempt to assimilate all peoples in the Syrian Greek Empire into a single homogeneous culture. They forbade particularistic practices like the reading of the Torah, and as a result, we began reading from the prophets, a portion of the prophets that correlate or relate to the Torah reading that would have been read. He also adds some additional detail about the Haftorah. He tells us something about its minimum content. He says, and I'll just speak this outside, I won't read it inside. He says as follows: when we have an aliyah, the shortest aliyah, when somebody's called up to the Torah, the shortest number of verses that can be read as a public calling up to the Torah is 3. Each aliyah has to have a minimum of 3 verses. How many people are called up on a Shabbat? How many people are called up on Shabbos to read from the Torah? 7. So that means at a minimum, the Torah reading on a Shabbat would have at least 21 verses, 3 times 7. And he says, as a result, the minimum number of verses that can be read as part of a Haftorah is likewise 21, also showing that correlation between the Torah reading that we would have been reading, but we can't today because of a decree, and the reading from Nevi'im. So he says, and this is reason number 1, the reason why we read the Haftorah is because there were periods of time when we couldn't read the Torah portion. Therefore, the practice developed to read from the prophets. And once you start a good practice, you don't discontinue it. And as a result, that practice has perpetuated until this very day that we read from the Torah and the prophets every single Shabbos and Yom Tov. Now, the very obvious question could be asked: does it make sense that the Greek Empire would decree you cannot read from the Torah, but reading from the prophets are okay? That calls into question this explanation. Why would they outlaw A, but still permit B if it fails to accomplish their ultimate goal, which is the assimilation of the Jews into Hellenistic society? So that's a very serious question that could be asked on this explanation of the Haftorah. And we're going to be discussing some other reasons also that are perhaps less problematic, and some of them are perhaps more historic than others. Let's take a look. Source number 2 provides a different reason. This is from Professor Lee Levine of Yale University, who wrote a book on the ancient synagogue. And he actually says that the reading from Nevi'im was a reflection of the contemporary zeitgeist. And he'll explain. So let's take a look. So we're looking at source number 2. It's right in the middle of the page in front of you. And it says as follows: it's impossible to say when the reading of the prophets were introduced into the synagogue worship, since they followed and presumably related to the Torah portion. They would seem to postdate the introduction of the Torah reading into the liturgy, which was likely in the 3rd century before the Common Era, at the latest. So he says, we can know since the Haftorah, the Haftoros, since they relate to the Torah readings, they must have come at some point after the weekly Torah readings were established practice. Otherwise, we would not have the established Haftoros that we have. And you can actually read in rabbinic writings that date from a very early time that specific Haftoros were read on specific Shabboses corresponding to specific parshios. So they have to postdate the time when the partios were established. According to rabbinic tradition, that was done by Ezra in the 4th century before the Common Era, slightly before the time that is indicated here by Professor Levine. And he continues, the Avudraham, which is the source that we just read, dates the institution of the reading from the prophets to the time of Antiochus IV's persecutions. That's the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the Antiochus of the Hanukkah story. While this medieval source has little historical value for our purposes, the period designated may in fact be not far off the mark. So he says, well, perhaps the historicity of that explanation is maybe not helpful, at least for what he's speaking to. He says that perhaps the dating is not incorrect. And he explains as follows. Both Ben Sira and the Book of the Maccabees already speak of the books of the prophets as sacred literature alongside the Torah. So it looks like he's saying from the literature that we have from that time, from the Book of Ben Sira and from the Book of the Maccabees, which are not part of Tanakh, but they are considered to be part of the Apocrypha. The Ben Sira especially is considered to be a great book for people to study because the messages are good. While not necessarily part of Tanakh, it's definitely viewed as being an important work even within Rabbinic Judaism. We see from within those two works that the Haftorah was already an established practice. That comes to us from that same time, the very early Hasmonean era. And he explains here what perhaps was the catalyst, what precipitated the Haftorah. The Hasmonean era, with its many upheavals and dramatic political, military, social, and religious developments, gave rise to messianic expectations and hope of renewed grandeur in certain circles. Apocalyptical speculation emerged, and eschatological groups such as the Dead Sea sect combed the prophets for contemporary allusions. The use of the prophetic corpus or variations of it, as the apocalyptic mode appear to be, seems to have flourished at the time, and it may well have been in this climate that gave rise to such an institutionalized recitation. So essentially what he's saying is as follows. People were really focused on Mashiach. They were focused on the Messiah. When is he going to come? When is the Davidic kingdom going to be reestablished? When will we have Jewish sovereignty in the land? They became very, very focused. Judaism became very apocalyptic, which means we became very focused on the end times or the days when Mashiach will come, when the established order will be overturned. And that became a major theme of Judaism. And in fact, if you were to take a look at many of the Haftorahs focus on what will happen when Mashiach comes, and especially as it relates to the Torah portion. So this seems to be borne out from the actual selections of the Haftorahs we read, and that is that they were institutionalized, they were adopted as part of a Weltanschauung, part of a sort of a cultural milieu that valued the lessons and the speculation that such readings would provide. So reason number two as to what perhaps was the catalyst that institutionalized the reading of the Haftorah was that they reflected the zeitgeist. They reflected the concerns, the angst, the anxieties of the people, and were reflective of increased interest in those kinds of writings. So that is explanation number two. Explanation number three is on the bottom of the page here. You can see on the screen in front of you. If you're looking along with me, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller so that you can see the English as I read the Hebrew. The next source that we're going to be reading is from Professor Eliezer Levi. He wrote a book called the Yesodos HaTefillah, which is the fundamentals of prayer. It's packaged as lessons on the liturgy and on the order of the service. It's a quite good book. I recommend it if you're ever interested, if you have a hankering to look up obscure Jewish literature. That's something you can look at. It is a lot of fun, but we're going to read what he says because he actually points out something fascinating. He says, B'yemei Bayis Harishon. He says he predates it from the time that we've been speaking until thus far. And thus far, we've been saying that we read the Haftorah and it dates from the sort of the latter half of the Second Temple period, from the time of the Hasmoneans, from the times of the Hashmonaim. He actually says that the reading of the Haftorah predates this. It's even pre-Babylonian exile. It comes from the time of the first temple, the first Beis Hamikdash. And this is what he writes. You can see it in the screen in front of you. Od b'yamei Bais Harishon koru b'navi mitoch Megillah lifnei ha'am she's asiv la'avodas Hashem b'shar Beis Hamikdash. He says a practice developed during the times of the first temple that words from the prophets would be read from scrolls before the people who would assemble in the temple for at times when the service would be conducted. What is the provenance of this practice? He writes, he says it comes from the prophet Jeremiah, from Yirmiyahu. Keshe'otzru es Yirmiyahu hanavi u'mina'u mimenu lavo lebeis Hashem lahashmiya es devarav. And there was a period in time, Jeremiah was not a popular prophet, because in the days when the temple stood, the first Beis Hamikdash, he said, you citizens of Yerushalayim, you Jews who live here, you got to mend your ways. If you don't, the Beis Hamikdash will be destroyed. And they couldn't fathom why he would say that, what he was going on about. And so they locked the door to disallow him from entering the temple to preach his prophecy. So his student, Baruch ben Neriah, Kosa Baruch ben Neriah divrei Hashem, asher diber el Yirmiyahu, al Megillah Sefer b'dio, v'kara divrei Yirmiyahu be'ozne kol Yehuda, haboim me'arehem b'chotzer ha'elyon. He says, and therefore you can actually see that this is reflected from the words of the prophet himself, that his prophecy was written down by his student Baruch. It was then brought into Yerushalayim, into Jerusalem, into the temple, and it was read there before the people. So according to him, Jeremiah was locked out of the temple. He therefore wrote his prophecy down so that somebody else would read it. And that's how the prophecy would be delivered in the temple in his day, which was the first temple. And he says that this was perpetuated. He says, B'yamei Golus Bavel, and that continued on after the temple was destroyed during the Babylonian exile. Yeshvu zikne Yehuda lifnei hanaviim lishmoa nevua unechama. He says also that, and therefore, during the time of the Babylonian exile, when the elders would gather in prayer, they would read from the prophets words of prophecy and words of nechama. So he says that this was a practice that was instituted during the days of Yirmiyahu and was perpetuated throughout the Babylonian exile, while the Jews began their practice of praying in synagogues versus offering sacrifices in the temple. And he writes, and he goes on and he continues. He says that this actually perhaps was an institution of Ezra. When Ezra instituted the weekly Torah readings, he writes, also instituted the reading of the Haftorah, as he himself was a student of Baruch, who was the student of Jeremiah. So Baruch, the student of Yirmiyahu, was Ezra's teacher, and therefore he says it's likely that when Ezra instituted the practice of reading weekly the Torah portion, there it was also instituted that we read a portion from the prophets as well, from the Nevi'im, in a way of perpetuating this practice that went all the way back to the first Beis Hamikdash. So this is reason number 3. Why do we read the Haftorah? The reason why we read the Haftorah, according to this explanation, is that it is tradition, it is history, and it was something that was perpetuated by Ezra from his teacher. So reason number 3 was that this was a pre-exilic practice that was maintained throughout the generations. Reason number 4. We turn now to source number 4. It's on the page in front of you. This here is from a work called the Shibbolei Haleket. Now, the Shibbolei Haleket was written in 13th century Italy. When we talk about rabbinic traditions, for example, we talk a lot about the rabbis of Germany and France, the progenitors of Ashkenazi Jewry. Or alternatively, we talk about the rabbis of Sepharad, of who are the progenitors of Spanish custom and Sephardi minhag. We don't talk a lot about Rishonim medieval authorities from Italy. They exist as a third group that at one point in time were as numerically significant as the other 2 Jewish communities and had rabbinic traditions that were just as just as hallowed and venerable as the other two branches of Judaism. Italian Jewry regrettably did not survive well. These definitely still exist, and they were definitely always present. There were always rabbis, and there was always traditions of learning that were observed there. But you don't find that they reached the same numbers as the other groups of Jews, and as such, they're somewhat obscure. They're not as well studied or as acknowledged as they probably should be. If you take a look at sort of historical patterns and trends and sources of tradition, Ashkenazi Jewry probably started off as an offshoot of Italian Jewry that was separated and evolved into something else on its own. But the original rabbis of Ashkenaz, all the great ones anyways, were largely descendants of Italian immigrants into the northern countries. It's an interesting historical eddy to get caught up in. But let's take a look over here. This was from Rabbi Tzidkiyahu ben Avraham Anov, who was also a doctor. So he was called Tzidkiyahu Harofe, Tzidkiyahu the doctor. And he wrote a halachic compendium in the 13th century called the Shibbolei Haleket. And he writes as follows. He says here, Matzasi b'shem Rabbeinu Shlomo. I found in the name of Rashi, he writes, he's quoting Rashi, because the Shibbolei Haleket himself, Rabbi Tzidkiyahu ben Avraham, did go into the north, into Germany, to study Torah in their yeshivos, and he came back to Italy to become a doctor and a rabbinic leader. He says that I found in the writings of Rashi, Minhag HaRishonim hoyo lisho sho'achas la'achar tfilason. He says, if you take a look at, Rashi explains, if you take a look at the Gemara in Maseches Brachos, you'll see that the early pious ones used to arrive an hour early before Tefillah, before Shacharis, and would remain an hour afterwards, after Shacharis. So they were there, let's say, for 2.5 hours. They were there an hour before, an hour afterwards, and they would pray half an hour, 45 minutes, however long it took. And he says that they would, because they were there and because they were meditating on God, what better way to meditate on God than to study Torah? And the practice developed, I'm just sort of paraphrasing here. The practice developed that there would always be a focus on reading from Tanakh, reading from Mishnah, and reading from the Gemara as being the three focuses of Jewish study. They would spend time after services reading from the Chumash, reading from the Torah, as well as reading from the Nevi'im. However, he writes, there reached a point when people were no longer as affluent as they had been in the past. And being that they're no longer as affluent as they had been in the past, they needed to work harder and for longer hours. And so he says, during the weekday, we stopped this practice of studying Torah and studying Nevi'im after davening because people just had to go off and go to work. However, he writes, on Shabbos, on Shabbat, we're at our leisure. We have time. Nobody's rushing off to work. And so as a result, the practice developed, he says, that we began reading from the Nevi'im as a form of Torah study that harkens back to this old pietistic practice of studying Nevi'im after Shacharis, after the davening. So he says this is reason number 4. The reason why we read the Haftorah is because we're studying Torah together. The public reading of the Torah is a form of teaching Torah publicly. That's ultimately what we're trying to do by reading the Torah, which is why, if anybody's interested, it's actually why I write the Parsha in a nutshell in the weekly handout. It's so that people are able to read something on the Parsha as the Torah reading is taking place. Many people don't understand the Hebrew. Some people aren't even following along. So they actually have something that they can refer to that talks about the Parsha. You can sit over here. It won't get sun in your eyes here. But the reading of the prophets is a further study that we're making together. And as a result, he says we're studying the Torah together, and it harkens back to this old pietistic practice of studying Torah and studying the Nevi'im after davening. And so this is reading number 4, that this is just a form of Torah study that we indulge in because we have more leisure time on Shabbos. That's the Shibbolei Haleket. That is reason number 4. Reason number 5 comes to us from Harav Yehuda Maimon Fishman, rather, excuse me. And he writes something really, really fascinating over here. He says that there is some historic precedent here. There's a historic polemic. We read the Haftorah as a polemic. What's a polemic, you might ask? A polemic is a form of argument where we do something or we say something to just shore up belief in a particular principle and try to refute or dispute an opposing point of view. And I'm just going to read from the English here. He writes, he quotes from the Avudraham. From these words, it would appear that the practice of reading the Haftorah is very ancient and began during the period, let me make this bigger, during the period of the Hasmoneans, he says. But as we noted, there's no evidence among early rabbinic sources to verify this origin. In fact, this theory is very difficult to understand. If the evil Greek Empire issued a decree barring the Jews from reading the Torah, why would they allow the Jews then to read from the book of the prophets? Therefore, it's possible to suggest that the practice of reading from the books of the prophets after the completion of the Torah reading was instituted out of concern for the Samaritans who denied the validity of the words of the prophet, and they said, we only abide by the words of the Torah given by Moshe and the book of Joshua. So these are the Shomronim. These are the Samaritans. They still exist. They still live in Israel. They live near Cholon. They are a group of Jews, and it's a bit of a discussion, rabbinic discussion, as to whether or not they would require going through conversion in order to marry into the Jewish community. But I think it's very hard to argue and say that they're not actually Jews. They are Jews, but they are a group of Jews who have a Torah that's very similar to ours with a few minor differences, most notably the 11th commandment, which says that the temple will not be built in Jerusalem, but will be built on Har HaGrizim. And they also deny the words of the prophets. They deny all the other prophetic texts. They only accept a book of Joshua, and their book of Joshua is different than our book of Joshua. So as a form of polemic, in order to dissuade the Jewish community of Judea from, I guess, taking into consideration the validity and the legitimacy of the Samaritan flavor of Judaism, we read from the prophets as a way of shoring up our faith and indicating that we view the books of the prophets as much a part of Tanakh as the Torah is itself. In order to dissuade those who might be influenced by the theology of the Samaritans and to embed into the hearts of the Jewish people a belief in the validity and the sanctity of the words of the prophets, our sages instituted the practice of reading from the works of the prophets immediately after the reading of the Torah in order to teach that all the words of the prophets are as true and as holy as the words found in the Torah. The Samaritans were at one point historically a much more potent force within the Levant. They were a much larger group, much more numerically significant, much more wealthy. They're not the same as the Karaites. The Karaites are different. The Karaites accept all the words of the prophets as well. They just reject authoritative rabbinic interpretation. But they're a different group of Jews. They actually have their start historically in Bavel, in Babylonia. But they started in like the 7th or 8th century. They're much more recent. The Shomronim are actually mentioned in Tanakh itself as a distinct group of people. We don't have to go into the history of the Shomronim, of the Samaritans, but they were a break-off group of Jews, perhaps, that dated from the time of the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel. And they're mentioned there as groups of individuals who were forcibly transported to Israel, who then adopted Judaism out of worry that the God of the land would reject them, and they have persisted ever since. So they're actually mentioned, they're spoken about in Tanakh, especially in sort of the later works, like in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and in the Divrei Hayamim, the book of Chronicles. That's where they are discussed in biblical texts themselves. So they're very old. They've been around for a long time. Anyways, so we have just then discussed 5 different explanations as to why we read the Haftorah. The Abudraham says that it was it was a decree from the Hasmonean era that we were not allowed to read from the Torah, so we read from the book of the prophets instead. Another explanation that we said it probably dates from the same time, but it reflected an anxiety and the zeitgeist where there was increased interest and focus on these kinds of portions that are read as part of the Haftorah. We had another reason that it is a perpetuation of an ancient practice that goes all the way back to the first temple and the prophet Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. We have the Shibbolei Haleket says that this was a way that we're able to perpetuate pietistic practices of Torah study, where we devote a portion of our time to studying the prophets. And we finally have the last explanation that says that it was possibly a polemical act to dissuade people to disregard the theology of the Shomronim, of the Samaritans. So let's talk a little bit about of some of the questions that we started off with. Why do we read the Haftorah? Well, why do we read the Haftorah? Well, we have 5 different reasons as to why we read the Haftorah. Why is it that we read a portion of the Torah before we read the Haftorah? Why do we go back? Why is it that the person who reads the Haftorah goes back and is a party to a rereading of the Torah portion? Why doesn't he just start with the blessings of the Haftorah? Why doesn't he just start there? Why does he continue on and just, why do we go back? So here we actually have an answer to that question, which also perhaps answers why we repeat a portion of the previous reading. And the answer we could possibly find, the possible answer we find is here in source number 6 from the Gemara, from the Talmud Bavli, Maseches Megillah specifically. And this is what it says. Iboyelahu. A question was asked to them. So the students in the Beis Medrash asked the following question. Maftir, this person who reads those additional verses before the Haftorah, Mahu sheya'ala leminyan shiva. On Shabbat, we're supposed to have 7 aliyos, right? Why is it that we don't just say that the person who's called up the 7th time is the maftir, and then he goes on to read the Haftorah? Why is it that the person who reads the Haftorah, when he is called up to a reading of the Torah, why is it that can that person be considered to be the 7th aliyah? Essentially is the question. That's the question here. Can that person who's called up to read the Haftorah, who first reads a portion of the Torah, can that be one of the 7 people who are called up to the Torah? And so the Gemara answers, this was actually a Talmudic dispute, here again in source 6, between Rav Huna and Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. And this is what their dispute was. So we're talking about sort of the middle Amurayim period. Ula, Chad Omar Ola, V'chad Omar Eina Ola. One of the two says that, yes, the person who's called up to the Haftorah can be the 7th Ola to the reading of the Torah. And the other one says, no, he cannot. Manda Omar Ola, the one who says that he can count as number 7, the Kakari, because he's reading from the Torah. What difference does it make why or in what manner he's reading from the Torah? He's reading from the Torah, he could be number 7. Lumanda Amar Eina Ola, the one who says, no, he cannot be one of the 7. He has to be in one that follows after the 7. Kid-Ula, that conforms to the opinion of Ula. To Amar Ula, Ula said, Mipnei ma hamaftir benavi tzorach sheyikra b'Torah techila. Why is it that he reads from the Torah first? Why does he read it? Why does he read from the Torah first before he reads the Haftorah? Mipnei kavod haTorah. It's a way of showing honor to the Torah. V'kevan de mishum kavod Torahu leminyana lo salek. Since he's not really reading it for Torah reading purposes, but rather he's reading Torah for the purpose of giving honor to the Torah, he cannot count as one of the 7. What does it mean to say that he's only being called up for the purposes of honoring the Torah? Here Rashi explains, Shelo yehe kavod Torah ukavod navi shaveh. People might draw the wrong conclusion. They might see, we call people up for the Torah, we call people up for the words of the Nevi'im. What's the difference? They're just as important. The Nevi'im and the Torah should have the same level of, weight in our mind. They should be just as significant as important. But that's not so. Obviously, the Torah is considered of greater significance than the prophets. So in order to show that the prophets are subservient to the Torah, that they're of lesser weight than the Torah, we therefore have him go back and say that you can't even start reading from the prophets until you read a portion of the Torah as well, to show that the reading of the prophets are of secondary importance, that you have to start with the Torah and then you can go on to the Nevi'im. And therefore, since it's considered only to be an adjunct, it's not considered to be of significance in the reading of the Torah. It's only being done in order to show that the Torah is important. Therefore, it can't be counted as one of the aliyos for the public reading of the Torah. And likewise, also, perhaps that's the reason why we repeat. Again, it's showing that this is not an actual reading of the Torah. It's only something that we're doing to give honor to the Torah and give it greater importance, showing that we start off with the Torah. We even will repeat the Torah before we go and start reading the prophets. We start reading from the Nevi'im. So that is the discussion here. There's a lot more that I want to say about the Torah, but I do want to also cover the secondary topic of today's class, which is the connection between the reading of the the study of Torah and prayer. I'm going to argue that the study of Torah and prayer are two sides of the same coin. They are both part of the same imperative. They are one of the same, two different ways that an imperative manifests, two different ways that we accomplish the same goal. And what I'm going to first do is show you that the study of the Torah, that we incorporate the study of Torah into prayer itself. We incorporate study of the Torah into prayer itself. And one reason why we do that is because sometimes verses from prophets, but like verses from Tehillim, from Psalms, verses from the prophets, and verses from the Torah serve a liturgical purpose. They also are a form of Torah study. And we can see this from several different places, but because we're running late in time, I'm only going to show you one or two places in which we see that the reading of Torah verses as part of prayer is considered a form of prayer, but at the same time, it's a form of Torah study. The two are playing out at the same time. Again, perhaps we can take this a step further and say that they're the same. But let's begin. Let's take a look over here. So you should see on the page in front of you, lesson 12, the link between Tefillah and Torah study. You might have to turn a page or two to get there in the handouts for those who are here in person. We have over here, it says on the top of the page, lesson 12, the link between Tefillah and the study of Torah. You might need to turn it one more page. You have it there? Okay. Very good. So he quotes from the Mishnah here. Brachos, Parak Aleph, Mishnah Beis, Me'emosai Karin es Hashma b'Shacharis. When is the earliest time that we can recite the Shema in the morning? Misha Yakir, Bein Techeles, L'Lavan. The unnamed authority of the Mishnah says that it's from the point in which there's enough light in the sky that you can tell the difference between your blue string and your white string in your tzitzis. Remember, we say as part of the Shema, we discuss the mitzvah of wearing tzitzis. We can, and since there are some threads are blue and some threads are white, we're supposed to have different threads. We should know that the tzitzis that we're wearing are kosher. They're valid at the time that we recite the Shema. Therefore, the earliest time that you can recite the Shema is from the time that you can tell the difference between the white string and the blue string. Rabbi Eliezer Omer being techeles lakarti. Rabbi Eliezer, however, says, no. You need more light in the sky. How do you know that your blue string is actually a blue string? Maybe it's a green string. So he says there needs to be more light in the sky. The earliest time that you can recite the Shema is when you can tell that the blue string that you're wearing is in fact blue. When do you conclude the Shema? Begomra ad hanetzachama. You can conclude the Shema. You have to recite the Shema before. When is the end of the time of the Shema? It's at the time that the sun finally rises above the horizon. Rabbi Yehoshua Rabbi Yehoshua, however, says ad shalosh sha'os. The third hour of the day. After the conclusion of the third hour of the day, that is the last time to recite the Shema. Why is this so? Well, the Shema says, you recite it at the time that you arise in the morning and when you go to sleep at night, right? So we say those words in the Shema, which indicates that the morning time to recite the Shema would be at the time that people arise. When we're at our leisure, we will sleep in until the third hour of the day, the fourth hour of the day, which is about 10 o'clock. Generally speaking, usually sometime between 9:30 and 10:30, depending on the time. But that's on a Sunday or a Saturday, if you didn't have to come to shul in the morning, I think most people would sleep probably until about 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. And that's what essentially says that's because when people who are at their leisure, like B'nai Malachim, like princely class, you do not have to go to work, that's when they arise. So that's considered to be the time when people wake up. That's when the Shema can be recited. So you can say it until the end of the fourth hour, so the beginning of the fourth hour, rather the end of the third hour. But what does that mean? Okay, so I'm showing up to shul. I've arrived late. It's at 10:30 in the morning. I have not recited the Shema yet, and it's past the time when I can fulfill the mitzvah of reciting the Shema. Does that mean that I skip the Shema and I go straight into the Shemona Esrei? Do I go straight into the Amidah? No, you still say it because you're not losing by reciting it because you're still studying Torah. So we see from this that when we recite the Shema, it fulfills a liturgical function of reciting the Shema, but it also has a secondary function, and that is that you're studying a Torah portion. You can't go wrong studying Torah. So we see that the portions of the Torah that we read as part of Tefillah are pulling double duty. They are also a form of Torah study. Now, I would like to explain this as follows. I'm going to skip a whole bunch here, and there's definitely much that we could say, and I hope that I don't lose too much from what we're skipping. But I do want to at least cover all of the stuff that I really want to get to, and that is why is it this idea that I'm trying to propose that the study of Torah and prayer are one and the same. We actually see this in the writings of Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. So what I'm doing is taking this further. Not only is praying and studying Torah, not only are you doing both at the same time, we can even say that they're both the same. And so therefore, there really isn't that much of a difference between them. Hence, we would be studying Torah as a form of prayer, and perhaps prayer as a form of study Torah. We'll see. So let's take a look. This is from the works of Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. We're turning the page. This is source number 8, where he says, Maimonides emphasizes the commandment, you will serve Hashem with all of your heart. What does this mean? It means you'll serve Hashem with your heart. This belongs to a class of general precepts, those which apply not to a specific case and act, but contain a norm whose innate applications are all-inclusive and refer to a total attitude of man towards God. And Tefillah represents only one facet of this precept of the Avodah Shebelev. The Torah says you will serve Hashem with all your heart. And the Rambam writes, Maimonides writes, that the serving Hashem with all of your heart is a reference to prayer. He says there's a biblical obligation to pray. He says, however, he explains that this idea of serving Hashem with our heart is not limited to only prayer, but it's also expressed in Torah study. The quotation from the Midrashic sources, which Maimonides utilizes in order to prove this thesis regarding the Pentateuchal character of prayer, supports our viewpoint that Avodah Shebelev, serving God through our heart, exceeds the narrow confine of formal prayer and liturgical performance. Studying the Torah is also included, since through the acts of learning and teaching, man expresses his inner religious self. What does it mean to serve Hashem with your heart? It's a way of interacting with God, as it were, in a manner that reflects our inner reality. So the Rambam says that this is a reference to prayer, of serving Hashem with your heart is a reference to prayer. It's a way of relating to Hashem that in a way that reflects our inner character. And he says, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, that the same thing applies to Torah study. Torah study also accomplishes the same thing. And he says that even within the source text that the Rambam utilizes, it's actually talking about the study of Torah also as a way of coming to meet with God, as it were, interacting with God, relating to God in a way that reflects our inner self. Since through the acts of learning and teaching, man expresses his inner religious self. Whenever the true God-seeking self appears on the threshold of our objective world, the miracle of avoda shebelev is achieved. This idea of serving God with your heart is expressed both through prayer and Torah study, because they're all ways of relating to Hashem in a way that reflects our inner reality. And he explains this. He actually takes this further in a different text. And we're going to read this one also. So now we're looking at source number 9. The mitzvah of Torah study demands from a person study, concentration, deep immersion, persistence, and other similar qualities, but it's all worth the effort because the final goal is to reach a rendezvous with the presence of the Almighty. Studying Torah can be compared to embarking on a journey whose destination can never be reached and traveling towards a place, and you're traveling towards a place that is difficult to reach. And he goes on saying much the same. Therefore, he says this is reflected in the obligation to seek God. It's an idea, the avoda shebelev imperative, to serve God with your heart, is the idea that we're meant to meet with God. And we meet with God in one of two ways. We meet with God through prayer, which is how we relate to God by understanding that there's a relationship and that we ask God, and he's the only one who can actually inadequately take care of our needs. And we also reach out to God through the Torah study when we make his thought process, his values, a part of who we are. The idea of meeting with God is the imperative here, the avoda shebelev, that we can now argue and say that prayer and the study of Torah are both reflections of that same principle, that same drive, that same imperative. And at the very, very end here, you can actually see this in the writings of Philo. Philo is not a traditional rabbinic source. Many of his opinions, I think, would categorize him as perhaps an apikoros, something of a heretic. But I think that he is venerable enough that we can refer to some of the things that he writes and take it and suss out meaning every once in a while. And I think this actually goes to the heart of it. I believe that Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik actually is paraphrasing Philo. Man's true function is to know God and to make God known. He can only know God only through his revelation, which is Torah study, and he can comprehend that revelation only by continued study. Again, that's where we meet with God. We meet God through Torah study, and we meet with God through prayer. That's the avoda shebelev, the service of the heart that is referenced when it says you will serve God with all of your heart. Hence, prayer and Torah study are permutations of the same mitzvah. And perhaps that's why we incorporate so many verses into our prayer as a way of expressing both of those ideas, that we're studying Torah and we're praying, and they're both one and the same. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording, and I am